Good morning.
Good morning.
So, this line in the song, may respect for all our differences enhance our common ties. That may be the toughest thing that we're trying to do these days, is to respect our differences. So, this is going to be less of a political rally than maybe some of you have wanted it to be, because I think we appeal so quickly to our brain stems and to our reptilian instincts that I do, as much as anybody, that I'm going to try to focus on moving us forward as a whole nation, and maybe put a little bit of a hold on the partisanship for today. On my father's side of the family, there was sort of an unwritten rule that you don't talk about yourself or your family, especially if it sounds like bragging. So I may violate that a little bit today because I want to talk about what I respect most about my grandfather, Robert A. Taft, who was nicknamed by his colleagues Mr. Republican. I want to explore his political and personal values and, unfortunately, how far the Republican Party of today has drifted from those values. I want to be clear. I will not endorse a candidate or a party in this talk, but I do hope that the Republican Party finds its way back to its more moderate, respectable, and constructive roots. I wish, in fact, politicians on both sides of the aisle embrace more of Robert A. Taft's personal values, and at least I hope that my talk today helps everyone in this room be a more engaged citizen, myself included, because it's a challenge to get more engaged these days. It's very easy to want to check out. So Robert Taft served in the Senate from 1938 to 1953. The last year he was majority leader. Many of his political actions I do not support, such as suppressing the power of unions through the Taft-Hartley Act. One historian said that, quote, his chief legacy was his quest to strip labor unions of their power to block fair labor laws. But I do admire many of the principles that guided his work. Historian James T. Patterson, who wrote the biography titled Mr. Republican, pointed out that three principles that Taft held most dear: equal justice under law, equality of opportunity, and liberty. Now, Taft believed that those principles required the federal government to get involved in regulating the economy and in some public welfare. He believed that the federal government had to play an active and substantial role in guiding us into the future. Today's Republican Party, on the other hand, seems hostile towards even reasonable regulations and welfare efforts to help the poor. Today's Republican Party sees the government as a problem. So here's how my talk's going to proceed. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the Republican Party. I'll examine then Robert Taft's embrace of the federal government's regulatory and welfare roles, the fact that government can help. And then I'm going to touch on the modern Republican Party and how they've given up on the idea that government can be constructive. The final part of my talk will focus more on Taft's personal values, such as integrity, honesty, courage, and dedication to principle. This past week, I wish we saw more of those values in Capitol Hill. Well, before the modern Republican Party was born, there were conservative principles that were embodied by many of the founders of this country. Many of them rejected the radical ideologies that were being promoted around the world, especially in France. And that meant that our revolution, as it was called, didn't really upend the economic hierarchy in this country. People who were in power before the revolution were pretty much in power after the revolution. It didn't threaten private property. But the founders did believe that the government could make society more just and equitable, so they were not just embracing the status quo. Huge caveat. Their blindness to slavery, notwithstanding, to the horrors that I've spoken about time and time again here, that was an issue, a huge issue. But despite that, they still had the belief that you could promote the general welfare. And I've tackled that topic and will in the future many times. But I want to focus on how people like John Adams believed that you could have a rationally based government that cares for its citizens through common sense and reason, not through ideology and passion. That's the basis of many conservative thinkers. The idea that Adams wrote about was that the science of politics is the science of social happiness. In other words, politics can make us better off. Adams and many of the other founders took a lot of this from the philosopher Edmund Burke. Now, he was the only member of the British Parliament to both support the rights of the American colonists while at the same time condemning the revolution in France as being too extreme. Burke believed that institutions and property should be protected from radical schemes to remake the world. A protective, moderating social system, he believed, would allow individuals to have initiative and enterprise, and that would help our country flourish. That was the essence of the conservative theory, at least. Now, the modern Republican Party that was born in 1854 came out of a desire to resist authoritarianism and mass movements, whether they manifested themselves in the slave system as a mass movement, or in populism, or in socialism. Lincoln's Republicans promoted free labor and individual enterprise. That was their main emphasis. That's why they wanted the Western territories free of slavery. Not so much because they were against slavery, but as they wanted the free territories to be open to white, primarily male people to go out and make a living and bring food to the cities to feed our nation. So real liberty from that perspective was only possible when there were resources and opportunities provided every person. That was necessary for individual enterprise to flourish. Now, the Republican Party of the 20th century also believed in the work of individuals and that would lead to the best nation we could have. And Robert Taft was very suspicious of FDR's New Deal policies. He felt like they were squeezing out individual initiative and creating dependency. Taft supported, quote, "those who are earning their own way. We must not create a deterrent to hard work." Along with that, he also favored other conservative principles like a balanced budget, spending within our means, and limited government. Limited, not non-existent. But Taft was also an institutionalist because he respected the American system and he believed that the federal government and the Senate and the House and the executive branch and the judiciary all played important roles in oversight of the economy and in public welfare. He opposed a lot of FDR's measures, but he never attacked the Federal Reserve. He never attacked Social Security. He never attacked the Securities and Exchange Commission, which were all important New Deal reform and relief efforts. And despite his anti-union image, it's more than an image, he did limit union power, but Taft did support the right of workers to strike. In 1946, when President Truman threatened to draft into the military the strikers from crucial industries, such as the strikers in the railroad industry, Taft opposed that. Taft said, quote, "that offends not only the Constitution, but every basic principle for which the American Republic was established," end quote. He added, "strikes cannot be prohibited without interfering with the basic freedom essential to our form of government." Now, Dwight Eisenhower, who defeated Taft in the Republican nomination in 1952, said that he found Taft unexpectedly liberal. In his first-term memoir, entitled Mandate for Change, Eisenhower noted Taft's support for pensions for the elderly, public housing, aid to education. Sharon Lithgow, in the March 1st, 2017 edition of Medium, calls Taft, quote, an important leader of the conservative coalition who confounded other conservatives with his liberalism. The liberalism that grew from Taft's understanding was that he understood that the private sector was not adequately meeting the needs of older and poorer Americans, and that government had to step in. This was certainly the case regarding public education, one of Taft's strongest efforts to promote. His chief political rival in the Republican Party, Thomas Dewey, and him both agreed that they had to have a flourishing public education system. They were at each other's political throats for other issues, but they supported funding for schools, because Taft did research and found gross inequities amongst how much money is being given to public schools. He saw in the South, especially, schools serving people of color were way underfunded, and he realized this was a danger. He also was very frightened by the fact that 1 million people had flunked the selective service exam to allow people into the military. And he knew that public education had to get funding. He concluded that federal aid was the only way to offer educational equality of opportunity. He also saw in the country an acute housing shortage after World War II. He frequently visited the slums of his native Cincinnati, his hometown, and he was convinced that only government program could provide good homes for low-income families. After visiting a housing project in Cleveland, Taft said that such housing projects, quote, have not only improved the condition of the people who live in them, but have raised the standard of the entire neighborhood. I believe that Congress ought to adopt the program and start the United States towards the elimination of what I think is the greatest social evil in the United States today. Homelessness? A Republican? That's the greatest evil? That's different. What resulted was the Housing Act of 1949 that Taft helped create, and while it had its flaws, it definitely did, it was still the most aggressively funded federal system for public housing pushed in this century. So how does this fit into the Republican conservative thinking of Taft? I've already said it, but let me emphasize this. Like most conservatives, he did not want to squeeze out entrepreneurial individualism and private business. But he was open to evidence and reason and saw that private enterprise was not serving those in the bottom parts of our society economically. He said, quote, private enterprise has never provided necessary housing for the lowest income groups. So laissez-faire wasn't going to work. Historian Richard Davies, in his book Robert Taft and Public Housing, said that fundamental to Taft's position was, quote, a belief that decent housing was a prerequisite for good citizenship. He saw in a happy, healthy, well-housed family a microcosm of democracy, end quote. Housing was essential to a sound and stable democracy and necessary for families to flourish. Taft explained, I feel that we have an interest in seeing that there is provided for every family in this country at least a minimum shelter of decent character, which will enable the American family to develop. I think he would roll in his grave if he saw the amount of people that are sleeping on the streets of this city. Taft allied himself with his arch political enemy, President Truman, who declared in 1945 that housing had to be seen by our nation as a right inhering in every American, regardless of income. When the federal government acted, 810,000 units of housing were built. Now, some of the very conservative Republicans grumbled about this. In fact, William White, in the biography of the Taft story, wrote of, quote, old gentlemen grumbling in their clubs that Taft is becoming a damn socialist. The head of the National Association of Real Estate Boards branded Taft as a fellow traveler held captive by the bureaucracy which is running this government. And they were shocked that Taft didn't understand, as they put it, that public housing would subsidize lazy and immoral people. It claimed that Taft, quote, does not any longer believe in the American private enterprise system. He is at heart a socialist, and so on and so on, because of his moderate policies, because of his realization that the government was not providing the bare minimum for so many people in our society. So Taft diverged from other conservatives who were overly extreme because he recognized that the free market was not working in certain cases. And without housing, people would not be able to enjoy equal justice under law, equality of opportunity, or liberty, the values that undergird his political philosophy. And he refused to sacrifice those ideals for the sake of party unity, political advantage, or personal gain. What was sacrificed this past week for party unity, political advantage, and personal gain? So Taft's approach no longer guides today's Republican Party. And political parties change, of course, that's natural, but let's look again at the history. Reconstruction Republicans after the Civil War, they favored an active government. Unlike the Democrats, the Republicans backed the military rule of southern states, incentives to build railroads, a high tariff to protect industry, and welfare measures. In the 1920s, Republicans shifted away from federal intervention and embraced a more laissez-faire approach. That's true, because by this time, business was booming and they didn't need government to be involved. They got a little cooled off by the progressives who were meddling in their affairs. Business was so strong that the Republican administrations of Harding and Coolidge and Hoover advocated for even more limited federal government. But after 16 years of Democratic presidency, when Eisenhower entered the White House, his administration seemed strikingly progressive. Eisenhower condemned the military-industrial complex, a term that he coined. He argued for liberal welfare policies. Recently, there was a Facebook meme going around about the 1956 Republican platform, which was after Robert Taft died, but it still reflected much of Taft's republicanism. And that platform included assistance to low-income communities, an extension of Social Security, asylum for thousands of refugees, more minimum wage protection, improving of employment benefits, protecting the rights of workers to organize into unions and bargain collectively, and to assure equal pay for equal work regardless of sex. A strikingly progressive Republican platform. It was really, I think, with Barry Goldwater, that the Republican nominee for president in 1964, that the Grand Old Party began its 5-decade march towards a more heartless, anti-government attitude. And even some Democrats, as we'll see, got caught up in this flood to the right as well. So Goldwater, unlike Taft, rejected all New Deal programs. He saw government in a negative light, initiating this Republican assault on active governance. Goldwater made no secret of his willingness also to appease white supremacists in the South. And 4 years later, Nixon doubled down on that in what was known the Southern strategy, appealing to racists that pulled Southerners into the Republican Party. The Republican Party became more anti-government in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan portrayed government as the problem and not the solution. He said, quote, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Conservative business interests applauded Reagan's attack on unions, most dramatically illustrated by his firing of over 10,000 striking air traffic controllers. Some of his policies were more moderate. He supported collective bargaining in local government, amnesty for millions of undocumented people, some gun control efforts after he was shot. But in the 1990s, Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America came in and pushed more anti-government sentiment into the Republican Party. And that worked so well that even Bill Clinton, a Democrat, tapped into this trend, declaring, when he was elected, the era of big government is over. That was a Democrat saying that. He proceeded to attack parts of our Social Security system and pursued a racist and oppressive criminal justice program. Now, George Bush was not as conservative and anti-government enough for some of the more extreme elements of the Republican Party, because Bush actually supported an activist government in some ways. He abandoned the conservative dedication to a balanced budget, that's for sure. He got the federal government involved in local schools, in the No Child Left Behind program. He even spent money on the recession bailout. He expanded some Medicare drug benefits. But that really angered the anti-government, small government portion of the party, and this led to the rise of the most regressive movement in recent years, the Tea Party, a direct result of Bush's somewhat moderate policies. And they declared that the root of all evil was the government, that taxes were nothing more than legalized theft, benefiting others, often of black or brown skin color. They condemned affirmative action, liberal immigration policies, and gun control. And that worked so well that even Obama, so progressive in many ways, was actually pretty moderate. He backed away from traditional support of unions, he deported a record number of undocumented residents, and even his health plan was based on a Republican government model that Romney used in Massachusetts. It was a far cry from socialized medicine. But the pull to the right was powerful, affecting both political parties, and the Tea Party continued to grow. And it's partially these forces of the anti-government mistrust that elected our current president. Without faith in good governance, Republicans developed a more obstructionist tendency, hampering government attempts to solve social problems. This only reinforced public anger at government inefficiency. Why not elect someone from outside the system? Someone promising to drain the swamp? As Donald Trump famously told Black Americans, what do you have to lose? Well, the Republican Party and much of America in general have lost faith in good governance and personal integrity. This, I do think, would have my grandfather rolling in his grave. Today, his values are less reflected in the Republican Party and in our country in general. Our current political gridlock and polarization and grandstanding and disrespect and naked self-centered ambition are putting the democracy that he lived for at risk. And I shudder to think of what he would feel about the current resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Taft respected evidence and truth, and our president today doesn't seem to believe they exist. Taft believed in limits on federal and executive power. Our president seems to think that he can do whatever he wants. Taft dedicated his life to ethical government, and I don't think our current president even would know what that is. He seems preoccupied with himself, only seeking political power, personal praise from the sycophants who surround him. I mean, I hear people say jokes nowadays. I tell them I'm a member of the Washington Ethical Society. They say, oh, well, you could use some ethics in Washington. But what I would really like to see more than anything else in the Republican Party and in all politics is the sort of personal integrity that I see in Robert Taft. So to explain this integrity, I'm going to turn to the Nuremberg Trials of Nazis, which was an example documented in John Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. It won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 1957, the year I was born. After World War II ended in the midst of a devastated, suffering, and chaotic world, the Allies chose swift and strong punishment, and Nazi leaders were put on trial, and many of them were sentenced to death. One of our members who just died a couple of months ago was one of the translators at those trials. And many people were cheering this swift justice. But in October of 1946, my grandfather spoke at Kenyon College in a titled talk, Equal Justice Under Law, where he criticized the Nuremberg Trials. Now, he found the Nazi leaders despicable, and he said that he personally would be okay if they were simply locked up for life. But He believed that he should put aside his feelings and advocate for what is right. And what he thought was right was to offer a fair trial where the defendants were given basic legal rights. And at the Nuremberg Trials, Taft said they were not. Instead, he explained, we degrade justice by going through the motions of a mock trial. A mock trial. Something that looks like a trial, but is just political theater. Like a trial without witnesses. Like a trial with a foregone conclusion. But that was the case in Nuremberg. The conclusion was no. And Taft believed that the Nazi defendants were found guilty of violating international laws made after World War II, applied retroactively. In other words, ex post facto laws, which is, according to our Constitution, unconstitutional. And the method of trying and punishing these war criminals Taft lamented violated basic judicial principles. He confessed, quote, I would almost rather see them executed by court-martial than to go through the elaborate procedure of the Nuremberg trials. My big objection, he concluded, is the use of the forms of justice to carry out a predetermined policy. That is the Russian idea of a trial. End quote. A mock trial, a kangaroo court. So Taft believed that the Nuremberg trials undermined the rule of law and appealed to our basest emotions, anger and a thirst for revenge. Taft said, about this whole judgment there is the spirit of vengeance, and vengeance is seldom justice. The hanging of 11 men convicted will be a blot on the American record, which we shall long regret. The rest of the world didn't agree. In fact, Taft was pilloried in the press for being unpatriotic. Some called him a traitor. And as criticism rose and rose, he stood firm in defense of principles of justice. And it reminded me of another situation in American history that I taught to my high school students for many years, when John Adams was accused of disloyalty and dedication to principles of justice. He believed, like Taft, that justice demands objectivity and a disinterested legal process. And Adams chose to defend the British soldiers accused of killing colonists in the Boston Massacre on March 5th of 1770, even though he said it, quote, procured me anxiety due to the great public criticism and verbal abuse. He stood firm, making sure to provide equal justice. Adams believed that the rushed condemnation of British soldiers would have been, quote, as foul a stain upon this country as the executions of Quakers and witches. So both Taft and Adams honored principles of fairness over immediate popularity. And this was a big part of what integrity meant to my grandfather. He tried consistently to live in accordance to high moral principles. He didn't always succeed. But his principles of honesty, respect for others, respect for evidence, and dedication to the public good above personal gain or partisan advantage. For Taft, politics was about public service. He did put his nation first. And that's one of the reasons why he kept news of his sudden diagnosis of cancer private. It's why he checked into the hospital under a false name. He didn't want his personal tragedy to distract from the work of governance. He minimized his pain and pretended that he would recover. In fact, my father told me that this privacy kept even him from realizing his father's grim, hidden diagnosis. So when Robert Taft died of cancer, colleagues on both sides of the aisle were stunned and saddened, because despite their political differences, they respected his intelligence, judgment, goodwill, and integrity. They would miss his ability to create alliances and coalitions, to move legislation forward, to help government work. Soon after his death, north of the Senate chamber, the Robert A. Taft Memorial in Carillon was built with 27 bells in a bell tower that rang throughout the day as a reminder of his values. This 100-foot tall marble tower stands, as the words that are etched into its base explain, as a tribute to the honesty, indomitable courage, and high principles of free government symbolized by his life. A subtle point that I want to emphasize is those wordings, that the tower is a tribute to the principles of his life, not to the person. Today, I wish the Republican Party reflected, in fact, I wish all politicians reflected, and I wish all of us could nurture in ourselves greater faith in government to help those most in need with the basic necessities for constructive life, but also a commitment to personal and political integrity. Thank you very much.